think Neil will be ready to go in a couple of minutes if you're ready.
I'm ready when you are. So it's great to see people assembling, but you just have to give me the green light.
Yeah, will do. I think we'll start we're due to start in a couple of minutes. So I think if everyone's happy, we'll get going now and more people can join as they're coming along. Okay, firstly, welcome everybody. It's great to see so many people on the call. A lot of you don't know me, don't know who I am. Unfortunately, I have to pass on Harsha's apologies. She has some family issues that she's having to deal with right now. So Harsha won't be hosting. I'm standing in and I'll do my very best. Good job. So hello everyone. The reason we're all together on Thursday the 5th of November is not to light a firework, it's to hear Neil Usher talk about his great book. I need to read a little bit of it, so it's being a great book, and also for our friends at KI, introduce us to a great new product.
What's happening?
So can I ask, first of all, if any of you are not on mute, could you please mute yourselves?
I'm not on mute.
Easier for us. So if you're not on mute, could I ask that you mute yourselves? Okay, so most importantly, over to Neil Usher. Neil has very kindly joined us to talk about his new book, Elemental Change. Neil is, and I quote, a work and workplace protagonist, a blogger, and a really good blogger, I have to say, a chief workplace and change strategist. I had the very good fortune of being part of a picture kutcher that Neil did some years ago. It's the first time I ever met him, and it was probably the best one I've ever done, and they can be a bit dodgy, a bit hit and miss, but it was amazing. So Neil is here to talk to us about his second book, Elemental Change, and I'll hand over to him in a few minutes. But before I do that, I'd like to pass over to Grace, I believe, who's going to talk to us about a new KI design. Now, Grace's chair looks ominously empty, so I think we'll have to fill some time till Grace reappears. But Grace is going to present to us on a product which I understand has some connections with Sargent a couple of weeks ago, if any of you were lucky enough to be involved in that. Kay touched on neurodiversity, so variations in the brain and how that's becoming a real driver in the workplace now. Actually designing spaces with neurodiversity as a major consideration. And I think that's one of the themes of the new product that Grace is going to talk to us about, is how we support neurodiversity in the workplace. So Grace, if you are there, can we head over to you for your presentation? No? I don't think she wants to.
1, 2, 1, 2. Quickly.
Hi guys, it's Susie from KI here. Grace is just getting back to her seat. So if you just give us a couple of minutes, she'll be right with us.
Right. Okay, that's great. We should play elevator music.
I'm not as mobile as I was before because I have to literally carry a computer with me.
Would it be worth it if she holds a computer or something?
Yeah.
Great to see so many people on this call, really positive, really good. So we're not all suffering from Zoom and virtual fatigue, which is really great to see. I always think it's worth coming out for things that are worth hearing, and this is definitely one of them. So Grace, I can see you poised and ready to go. So let's hand over to you. I'm going to turn my camera off so that you don't see me. Can I ask you guys, I think if we turn the cameras off, maybe we'll see Grace on the bigger screen.
Yeah.
Hi everyone, welcome to our showroom. Thank you so much for being here with us. We had something else planned, but we're just gonna do it live walkthrough through our showroom. I'm Grace. I'm a senior designer here at KI in London. Following through from our last meeting talking about neurodiversity, we wanted to show you what we've been working on for the last 18 months. This is it. It's called Colonnade. It is a system that uses that is built upon user flexibility. It can be retrofitted using your existing AI storage, or it can be a new build, basically to suit what your space needs. It builds upon our existing A800 series storage and shelving. We've added this gantry system that allows you to hook any accessories you want to make the space your own. This is particularly helpful for either, and so these are these are the accessories we have. So it's a mobile seating. You can also do whiteboards or pinboards, acoustic paneling, and curtains. The idea with the system is that it is a basic shelf that then you can customize by adding different accessories, which is very good for neurodiversity. So yeah, this upper gantry allows you to hook any accessories you want. So the whiteboards are movable, or you can add different accessories to it to sort of make a sense of space. It's particularly great when you have an open plan office and you want to divide a space to sort of make your own and give a bigger sense of space. If you have any questions, or if you have any projects that you have in mind, we would love to work with you to create a project that's specific for you and your clients. So just send us a message. Thank you.
Okay, Grace, that's fine. While you're still there, don't leave our shot, Grace. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to put to Grace about the product? It looks really interesting, Grace. It sort of looks like it's a sort of a skeletal frame that you can add things to. Would that be right?
Can you say that again? Sorry.
Well, it looks like its concept looks almost like it's a skeletal frame that you can just add things to. So it looks like it can be it's fairly good to customize.
Exactly. And all the components can be customized for what you need. So it depends on your storage needs or how private or how open you want the space to be. You can do different things with it, and also you can add accessories. And the great thing about the accessories is that they don't have to be in the same place always. So it can be very easy and fluid to move it from one position to the other, depending on what you need in that particular time. So it also suits different types of teams, different types of activities. So the idea is that it's a very simple framework that it will be changing depending on what the team needs at that particular time. And it also can suit different size teams within this frame. And what we found it's really helpful is the sense that it's so easy to install that we've got a lot of queries of people wanting to retrofit it to their open plan offices to sort of create different spaces. So it is sort of like a little sort of like enhancement to that space that creates a lot of things, not just within it, but around it, because it creates a sense of space. So it's not only what happens inside of it, it's sort of what happens in all the sides of it and what you can do with the different accessories.
Would you say one of its main features is that it's very scalable? So
yeah,
it can get bigger and smaller as the space requires, and your teams grow and then they shrink, and so teams.
Yeah, definitely. All the components are modular, so it is about adding another module, making it a bit bigger, adding another storage. Then let's say you have just shelving, freestanding shelving, but then you have more storage requirements, then you can switch one of the elements and for them to suit like your needs at that particular time. So it has different levels sort of customization and user control during time as well.
Okay, so if anyone on the call wants to find out more about the product, is the best way just to reach out to you or the team?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Especially we're sort of very keen in finding sort of very custom and particular ideas and working together with each designer to sort of use all the components that we have for them to suit to suit that particular project the best way.
Okay, that's great. So we can direct people to you if they have any inquiries.
Definitely, would love to.
That's great. Thank you so much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so great. So now I shall hand over with no further ado to Neil Usher to talk about his book. So Neil, take it away.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for joining, particularly this close to wine o'clock. Bear with me while I set it up. Hopefully you can see a title page. Yep, fantastic. So I've met a number of you before, and I'm pretty sure I met some of you when I talked about my last book, which seems like a lifetime ago, The Elemental Workplace, which some of you may have read. And that was really sort of started to take root in 2016. I was in the process of thinking about doing something as my Sky role came to an end. And I was encouraged by a number of people to put it all down and write this book and sort of try and give something back. It was quite an adventure, really, moving from a sort of 500-word blog post to what was effectively a 50,000-word book, and then trying to move back and sort of talk about it. But there were probably about 10 pages in The Elemental Workplace on the subject of change. And it seemed to resonate with a few people. I had some really good comments about those particular 10 pages. And so I guess gnawing away in the back of my mind was this sort of intent really to try and talk about change a little more. I did actually start down the road of writing a second workplace book, and then sort of thought, well, why am I doing that? I've written the workplace book that I've wanted to write, so let's really start to focus on change. And I have to say, it's probably taken about 2 years, written in all sorts of places, unlike the first book, which I sort of really sat in a room and wrote in monastic silence, just sort of me, the computer, and lots of swearing. Whereas this one was written sort of wherever I could, really, trains, planes, swimming pools, wherever I happened to be. Sort of trying to piece it all together.
No, it's okay.
Sorry, getting some interference. Someone's not on mute. Thank you. It's fantastic. But basically, I'd had a sort of overriding sort of idea really in The Elemental Workplace that we're all change professionals first and foremost. That everything we do is change, everything we're leading is change, and we're actually sort of workplace professionals as a sort of secondary consideration. But we very often tend to see in the work we do on the workplace ourselves as workplace professionals first, and sort of somewhere downstream we do a little bit of change work if that's deemed necessary, or we bring someone else in to do some change work. But actually, I really wanted to kind of, sort of put my sort of commitment to all of this where the idea was in the first place, which is if we are all change professionals, then really can I apply the same sort of structures and the same approach and the same thinking that went into the first book into the second one, which is why it looks fairly similar in terms of the same graphic and a similar style. And as you'll see as I talk about it, that I've applied some of the same sort of structural thinking to that. So this really is a sort of summary really of those 2 years of sort of self-doubt and imposter syndrome and sort of as many commitments I think to give up and not continue with the book as there are pages, and there's about 300 of those, so it was probably quite an emotional journey in the whole process. So in many ways I want this book to be, in terms of sort of satisfying some key criteria really, very, very similar in sense to the Elemental Workplace, where I want it to be applicable to not just the workplace sector, but whatever sector we're working in, whatever industry we're working in, whatever sort of budget, whatever culture, whatever location. It should really be something that is completely portable, transportable, transferable wherever we go. In which case, it only becomes useful if it satisfies 2 other criteria, really, which is we can understand it, so we can tap into it, we can start reading it, start applying it. And in applying it, it really has to be usable. It has to be something that we can actually do something with. This isn't an exercise in sort of navel gazing. This is really something that I hope will actually be of practical use in the same way that I hope the last book was, if you ever sort of got to grips with it. And it really sort of stems from one main premise here, which is that we often think about leading change or dealing with change in our professional lives in a slightly different way than we think about it in our personal lives. Something happens to us when we go through that revolving door somehow, where we start speaking in a different language, thinking in different ways, we dress differently, you know, we don't do that quite as much now when we're all talking to our computer screens, but you know, that sort of whole kind of notion that going through the revolving door means something different. But actually, if change sort of sits above and over us all, then really a lot of what happens in our personal life is the way that we need to relate to change in our professional life as well. And let's face it, it's a bit of a mess, really, at the end of the day. We're constantly conflicted with everything we're trying to do. You know, there is a fundamental conflict of interest because we're involved in the change process that we're trying to initiate or trying to drive. And that, you know, it's frustrating, it's annoying, it's unpredictable, and yet, you know, we need to sort of try and make sense of all of this as we do in our personal lives. We need to do that in our professional lives, because change is literally everything. And that's sort of an underlying premise of this book, is that it's no different in our personal and professional lives. It's messy, but actually it's everything. And so we need an understanding of change. We need to understand how we can lead change. It's not someone else's job in anything at all that we do. I'd like to sort of acknowledge the contribution really of two fairly sort of disparate characters in all of this. On the left-hand side is the ancient Greek thinker Heraclitus. Most of what survives of work from those days is on sort of small fragments and tablets, rather than going to the library and picking out one of his books or interpretations that others have made. But he was probably the original change consultant, the one who told us that everything is flux, that everything flows, that we never step twice in the same river, that effectively the river has moved on, and so have we. So everything is constantly changing and constantly evolving. And on the right-hand side, for those of you who've ever read Viz Comic, this is Professor Piehead. He manages to blow himself up every time he experiments with something, and his lab assistant as well. But there's something about Professor Piehead that really used to sort of fascinate me, really, which is that he had this amazing sort of indomitable spirit. He just kept coming back. Nothing ever dissuaded him from continuing to experiment. Very human in the way that he approached it all, very sort of aware of the emotional impact and the emotional context of change. And also, he recognized that change succeeds by degree. You know, he always used to say, as he says here, another partial success. Probably wasn't quite as successful as he'd like to be in most instances, but we very rarely fail in total. We very rarely succeed in total. So very often what we're dealing with is navigating our way through a degree of success with the change programs we're leading. And as with the last book, one of the first things I do is dispense with a few myths. I won't go into too much detail with these here right now, but the sort of primary one of these really is that we hate change. And I'd say in the book, a little bit of me dies every time I hear this, because change is everything. You know, we're constantly casting hooks into the future. And if we think about our own personal lives, just about everything that drives our personal lives is us desiring or planning for or seeking some sort of change. And very often we do that in our professional lives too. There may be specific instances that we don't agree with or we don't like because we've created a pattern that's familiar to us and is comfortable to us. But to say we hate change is like saying we hate weather. You know, we just can't make that statement. There's a lot of talk at the moment, particularly with COVID, about the pace of change increasing. You know, probably liken this really to this sort of candy floss, really. It's just a sugary takeout that doesn't really mean anything. We've got no evidence to support this, and actually plenty of evidence to support the idea that the pace of innovation and change is actually slowing. And the third one here, just to mention, is I'm sort of dispensing quite early with the idea that we change in a very smooth curve, and the grieving curve has almost become synonymous with a change curve in the last couple of decades. I'm not really quite sure how that happened, and I did try and find or trace a sort of a development or a pathway that this particular curve took. But as I'll argue through the course of this talk, and I do through the book, it's emergent and it's iterative. Changes, you know, the emotions that are usually attributed to the stages of that curve, we will experience constantly in an ever-evolving state. A little later, I do dispense with two things that particularly annoy me about change. The first one of these being buy-in, because I don't believe change is a transactional activity, and it's just as easy to buy out as it is to buy in. What I'm really seeking in the activities we engage in are critical participants, those people who are with us, you know, who are always helpful with their insights and their critique. You know, sometimes it's constructive, sometimes it's not, but we need to hear these voices, and we need to sort of we need to take in this insight because it's incredibly important to us. And the whole idea of quick wins, but in simple terms, if it was that quick a win, then really why haven't we done it so far? And I think the danger with quick wins is that change programs can very quickly sort of come to a halt as a result of our obsession with this sort of transactional type of approach. So the book is in 3 parts essentially. At the bottom, sort of building from this, are reflections on change itself, and I've created what I consider to be an infrastructure of change, which I'll touch on, with 3 levels of thinking. And a lot of the change books that I read during the research and consideration of some of the themes of the book, very, very frequently just either don't feature this or they gloss over it straight away. But I just don't think that we can start to consider the preparation for change or any of the action we'll take until we actually understand change and we have some kind of, at least rudimentary philosophical basis for thinking about change. We then move into what I call the operating system of change. And as I'll stress, there's a big difference between planning and preparing. Planning is when we are in a sort of situation of some certainty, whereas preparation is much more likely to be useful to us, in particular in situations like we're facing now, where we really don't know what's going to happen next, but we need to be prepared for any eventuality. And that operating system has 6 components. And then there are 9 elements of change, the things we do, the action we take. It's all very well having a good understanding of change and being prepared for it, but what do we actually do when we're leading a change initiative? Yes, sorry? Someone say my name? No, okay. So I'm going to go through each one of these parts, if that's okay. So first of all, why we're doing this, and one of the things that I think is particularly important at this time really is our attempt to make sense of the world. And this is quite a useful little sort of sense-making tool, and some of you may have seen these expressions before, as uttered by Donald Rumsfeld in 2002. So try and suspend your recollection of that for the moment. But if we think about what we know and our appreciation of the world and the situations we face, we're really looking at sort of at our world in through 4 lenses. And it helps us to split this out because there's a tendency at the moment in particular to get pretty sort of drawn into thinking that everything is in one lump. Everything we see and we experience, we're just dealing with it in one way. But there are some things we know, probably not as many as we think initially, but we can plan for those. If we know what we know, then we can create a plan because it's going to happen in a very linear fashion and it's going to happen sequentially, and everything we think is going to happen is going to happen. And that's pretty straightforward. We then sort of start to move in a clockwise direction, and we think about the things we know we don't know. We can plan for those, and they usually revolve around creating options because there are certain eventualities that may occur, but we're pretty sure we know what those paths may be. Then we get into the whole area of the unknown unknowns, and if we don't know what we don't know, then we can't possibly create a plan, we can't possibly develop options. But what we can do is we can prepare, as I was talking about just now. And then we get into probably one of the trickiest areas of all, and these are the unknown knowns. These are the things that we do know, but we've suppressed our knowledge of them, either consciously or subconsciously. We're burying these things away. And if we think about the workplace, just prior to the first lockdown, we were really starting to make some progress with mental health issues as they pertain to the working culture and the physical space of many organizations. And we're really starting to acknowledge those issues and start to develop strategies to deal with them. But what's happened is we've sort of suspended all of that, and now we're really focused on the mental health issues of spending a lot of time on screen, Zoom fatigue, these sorts of things. But somehow, when we're talking about potentially returning to the workplace, we've almost suppressed what was going on in relation to mental health issues leading up to that point. So with these issues, we really have to face up to them. So I'd ask you to sort of just bear this sense-making structure in mind, really, as I talk about some of the ideas associated with change. And these ideas exist, I think, at 3 levels, and I'll be very sort of brief with each of these. At a universal level, these are the sorts of what we might term, if you're sort of interested in philosophy, the sort of metaphysical ideas, really, those ideas that I touched on when I mentioned Heraclitus about change being everything that surrounds us. Everything that we are, it being our absolute essence, I talk at this point as well about sort of, you know, the ideas of transformation and evolution. We use those terms interchangeably, but actually in biological terms, transformations are very small but significant activities. It's where one cell consumes another cell, and most of the time it's fatal. But occasionally it does actually create something new. But actually the more powerful idea in all of this is evolution, because evolution comprises a whole sequence, a number of these generally accidental transformations. But it's very easy in change terms to think that our change project isn't important unless we call it a transformation. So I'm trying to sort of bring the idea of evolution back to the surface, really, to say that evolution is probably the most powerful idea in respect to change, more powerful than the idea of transformation. But very often it's regarded as the junior partner. And on this basis, what that means is that just about everything we're doing in our lives is an experiment. You know, everything is never finished. Software engineers talk about beta trialing, where with an effective feedback loop, which I'll talk about in terms of communication in a short while. But what happens is all of our colleagues are effectively co-designers of the spaces we create in a similar way, that we are listening, we are constantly adjusting. And when someone launches a software product, they've got no idea what number their sequential releases are going to reach. It's just a continual evolution of the product and the service, listening, adapting to what's happening in the world around them, adapting to the views of the consumers, and constantly evolving. So everything, if everything is changing, then nothing is ever finished. We are living in this, this ongoing experiment. The global ideas are those that are, sort of one ramp down from the metaphysical, really, but they do govern our lives in a broader sense than just the context we operate in. These include things like our worldview. Everyone on this call will have a very different view of, let's say, the US elections. Our view of US culture, US society, US politics will be governed by our own education and our own experience of the world, and the way that others have impacted it. So our worldview is absolutely critical, as well as the actual broader landscape in which we're operating in, and the external influences we have. And lastly, in this area, we forget sometimes that the evolution of our cognitive capabilities was primarily one that occurred in sort of Stone Age times, effectively. Most of the impulses and the reactions in our mind are those that really developed over thousands and thousands of years, when we were literally hunter-gatherers living in caves, hunting in the forest, and waiting for a clear sky and a full moon. We're trying to superimpose that cognitive structure on the modern world, and sometimes we just can't help what happens as a result of that. And then some of the local considerations, in particular context, things that we can and can't do, and our values, the things that we will and won't do. And if we think about it in that sense, and we consider another four-blocker in that sense, there's only one category where we're operating in a space where there are things we can do and things that we will do. And so all of the other three areas create some problems and issues for us. And it's at this point in the book that I really start to look at resistance being sort of one category, but also inertia and complacency as actual sort of, those things standing in the way of successful delivery of change. I don't dwell too long on them. I think it's very important to understand them, and I think it's very important to know the difference between those three ideas, because they are all very different. And again, we can't lump all of those things into one place. But as I hope you'll get the sense of, this book is a very positively focused book about change. It's about how to make it happen when nothing is standing still and everything is continually moving. But just before I leave this section on that, the uncertainty that exists before us is our opportunity. And most organizations and corporate structures are all geared around creating certainty, trying to iron out any uncertainty in what's happening. But the difficulty is that if everything's certain, then nothing interesting ever happens. And there's very little possibility of anything happening, because we are in that known sense-making pain. And effectively, everything before us is a clear linear path. Everything will happen as we expect. And we wonder really what use there might be for any of us in a world that is entirely certain. So uncertainty is something to be grasped, and it's something to really be played with here, and it is the opportunity that we face in every instance. So how are we going to do this? Our preparation for change. I don't know if you've seen the spider chart that sort of came after the first book. I thanked Ian Ellison for his telling me one evening that I really needed a structure and framework for the 6 E's of a fantastic workplace, and that sort of gave rise to both of us thinking about what it might look like and what it might be called. And I landed on the spider chart. He said, "You need a name for this," and that's where he decided to call it Neil's Diamond. So, you know, Neil's Diamond is back 2.0, which are the 6 components of our operating system of change. Now, everything we have has an operating system, you know, and the operating system is almost the unglamorous part of the kit we carry and the kit we use. We love to play with the applications. That's what means everything. And we actually like the sort of, you know, the tactile nature of the devices, and we talk about our new phones and tablets and laptops and things. But actually the operating system in anything is absolutely vital. Otherwise it is literally just a box of useless wires and plastic. So the operating system of change ties all those ideas that I talked about in relation to change to the things we'll actually do. And these things need to be in place. This is our preparation. We have to have these things in place for us to deliver change effectively. I'll just run through them very briefly. The opportunity. Very often we're straight into the vision, but the opportunity needs to be understood. We need to understand the history, how we got here, where we're at now, where we might get to. For every opportunity, there's an equal and opposite risk. But I'm using the approach to risk to actually start to map opportunities. I think we can, you know, again, most organizations are focused on ironing out risk wherever it exists, rather than actually sort of generating opportunity. So we can actually sort of flip that. We can apply the same sort of thinking to risk management, to opportunity creation and mapping that. But this is where we identify the change. We can see what's possible. Then when we're into the vision, this is where it's sort of inspiring the possible. Visions have to be an inspiration, but I'm taking a new angle with the vision because I think it's much better positioned for us as a question than it is a statement. And when we think about questions, they're incredibly powerful because they hijack the brain completely. There's almost nothing we can do to resist trying to answer a question that is tabled to us. So, you know, instead of saying we want to be the world's leader in the production of something, it might be, you know, how do we become the world's leader in the production of something? It makes people feel involved. It makes people feel that they've got an opportunity to help answer that question as well. So thinking about the vision as a question, I think is you know, it's not something that I originated, but I did find some really interesting sources for it, and I think it's a much underplayed approach to vision creation. And in terms of evidence, in terms of proving that change is possible, I really focus on data and stories. Plenty out there about data. I've given it some structure in terms of the sort of the phases of data, but when we're thinking about evidence, stories are data with spirit. Stories are just as important. They actually make data come alive. Data on its own can be really dry and really uninteresting. So stories are important, not just in themselves, but in making data come alive. And with stories, we have to tell them and we have to gather them. It's a two-way process. Leadership is probably fairly self-evident in change. This is where we demonstrate how we can deliver change, and I've tried to create a sort of very, you know, in the space of a few pages, a very simple structure in terms of sort of, you know, what makes a good leader and what makes a good leader of change. There's plenty of material out there about sort of, you know, about great leadership, but again, I've tried to bring it back to something usable and practical and meaningful. And trust exists on 2 levels, really. One is personal trust, but also trust that operates in groups. You may have come across the expression psychological safety. There's quite a lot of talk about it now. I've sort of expanded this really into the idea of elemental safety, because I think we need to pull apart the rational and the emotional, just the sort of the rational process of thinking something and taking a safe position on something. But also the emotional in being safe to express something. And that expression may be verbal, but it may be in other ways too. It may just be in terms of turning up to something and being part of something. But the physical is often dealt with completely separately, and I think that's wrong. And there's a number of reasons, I think, but a couple that really spring to mind. Just about everybody now knows what PPE stands for, and probably, you know, a year ago, only people in sort of, you know, in medical environments and facilities management understood what personal protective equipment was. But now everybody talks about it, everybody knows what it is, because we're very aware of the physical risks in our work and in society generally in relation to the pandemic. But also, we think about it, the Me Too movement was incredibly important in actually surfacing the physical challenges that many women had faced for decades in the workplace, if not forever in the workplace. And their discomfort very often with the situations they found themselves in, and so I think that, you know, when we talk about feeling safe at a group level, that trust at a group level, it has to encompass all three elements here: the rational, the emotional, and the physical. I don't think we can talk about the physical as being something else or something of a lesser quality than the rational and the emotional. And then finally, the resources we need, and I talk really about sort of, you know, money and people and administration and things. But here, you know, this is probably about the sort of main time that I talk about the plan. You know, we need a plan. It needs to be a very soft plan. We need that plan to be able to react to change and be flexible enough to deal with new information, new evidence as it emerged, changes in that opportunity that we were pursuing. So, you know, there is a place for a plan, but it very much takes, you know, plays second fiddle to our preparation for change. And then finally, what are we going to do? The actions we take, and probably unlike the periodic table in the first book, there is a bit of a relationship in this periodic table. There are three groups, being the vertical columns. And I'll touch on each one of these. But just as with the elemental workplace, I think it's important that each one of these has a part to play in any change initiative we're involved in. We can dial some of these up and dial them down, but essentially each one of these needs to be present to some degree or other. And, you know, we very often have a shopping list of things we might want to do, and they're very sort of practical and they relate to the project, you know, in hand. But again, this is very transferable, very applicable to a workplace project, but just as applicable to anything else entirely. The first one of these is about us being informed. So the very first of these is the lexicon and the tone of voice. We can actually indicate to people that something is changing just purely by the way we speak from the very outset. Sometimes it involves us having to almost learn a whole new sort of vocabulary at times, you know, in terms of moving that change. But also the way we say things, the sort of the actual tone of our writing and the tone of our speaking can give a very early indication that something is different. And I've worked with a number of clients where a lot of focus is given to this, because the tendency is just to keep sort of communicating in the ways of old, and actually forgetting that there's a fantastic opportunity right from the very word go to do this. In terms of the message, this is fairly straightforward. It's about why we're saying what we're saying, how we say it, what we're saying. So I've tried to structure some guidance around keeping that messaging sort of tight and meaningful. Sometimes that will be a broadcast, and sometimes a broadcast is necessary, but in the majority of instances, there needs to be a response to the messages. There needs to be a circular loop. We need to have this feedback loop, because this is part of the experimental nature of most of what we're doing, which is that we need to listen, and we need to listen to everything. You know, even the bad news and even the negatives have some insight within them, and we need to listen effectively and listen positively. There are some cautionary notes around each one of these three sections about being informed, and then the next two about being engaged and being involved, because it's not all upside. So I have tried to sort of point out where some of these things can go wrong, and what we might do to make sure that we're aware of what's happening. So we might know what's going on, but actually we need to feel what's going on as well. We need an emotional connection with what's happening. And I think we create this in three ways, with the people involved in the structures we create, from the governance to the change champions to the created stock that we use. There's some people and some stuff that we need to bring together to create the sort of the passage really for that emotional engagement. And then there's the example we set on a personal level, and every one of us that's part of a change process or a change initiative will at some point be called upon to, to actually live what we're talking about, to actually behave in ways that we're asking others to behave in. And I think to make personal commitments as a leader and then hold ourselves accountable to our team. I am going to commit to do something, and if I don't do it, you have to tell me, and you have to tell me what I've done wrong. We might not want to do that in the middle of a huge emotional flare-up, but there'll be a point in time afterwards where we can say to leaders, look, you said you were going to do this, but in the situation that we encountered the other day, you did something different. So there are ways that we can create, we can start to build trust here as well. So a lot of the action we take within what we do actually does help to reinforce and build the preparedness that we have that I discussed in the second part of the book. And then we're into the more experiential, tactile things like roadshows, exhibitions, town halls, and experiments and pilots, which are very often particularly a feature of a workplace change project. But we sometimes get those two confused, or we use those terms interchangeably. Experiments are very open-ended, where we're testing a lot of things, whereas pilots are sort of much more sort of closed-ended in effect. All we're trying to do is iron out the last few little bits and pieces. So we actually have a very limited agenda with a pilot, and I explain the difference between those two. And then finally, with people having been informed of what's going on, feeling something, getting emotionally engaged, we actually want them to do something. We actually want people physically involved. And a lot of the ideas here I took from social activism, social activism is about getting people involved. And what's actually quite amazing when you start reading about sort of social activist theory is you actually need a fairly small percentage of involvement to actually start changing people's perceptions and changing people's positions on things. In workplace projects in particular, we try and get quite a few people involved, and sometimes probably overreach ourselves. But actually, it doesn't take mass involvement to change. It actually just takes a reasonably small number, but those being active. And there are some tips and tools in here on how to create that level of activism. But I think this exists on three levels. There's people showing up, being present. They might attend a roadshow or attend an exhibition, not really do anything, but just be there. There are those who then sort of are active because we've asked them to do something. We've brought them in, they've been invited, or they've been told to be part of what we're doing, and they're getting involved and they're being directed in doing so. And then lastly, there are those who are actually showing initiative, getting involved because they love the idea, they love what we're trying to do, and they just think it's a great thing to do and they want to be part of it. This is where I talk about the idea of tunneling, which I referenced in the last book, but I still think is hugely relevant, which are people doing things differently and talking about doing things differently. And you may have heard it in the context of the expression working out loud. It's very similar in that sense, but a lot of the successful evolution that we drive and the adaptation people engage in is driven by the behaviours and the conversations created by others, which is why in social activism it's not always necessary to get everybody involved, but you just got to get the right people involved and enough of them to start creating this effect. So this brings us back to this periodic table. I'll always get asked with the last one, so what are the 2 or 3 most important things? And I'd reiterate here, I'm not sure there's anything in here that's more important than the other. What is important is that all of them feature to some degree or other, and that they make sense together, and they hang together in that way. But depending on what you're doing, we may dial some up and we may dial others down. So I'd like to leave you with just the reassurance, really, than pretty much what I started with, which is that we are all leaders of change. We often don't think of ourselves as that. We often think it's someone else's role, but that's what we're doing. If you think about everything you're doing in your personal lives and your professional lives, somewhere along the line, you're trying to make things better, do things differently, make things happen differently, and you have a role in that. You might not be formally titled the leader of that change, but you will have a role in what you're trying to do. And many of you on this call will be involved in, design and creativity. Everything that you're doing is creating a change for the recipients of the work that you're engaging in. So very conscious of time, but that's a whistle-stop tour of elemental change. I would love to hear your thoughts on it. Love to hear the questions now. Got time for some questions. If you do get hold of the book, I would be delighted to have that conversation with you, to keep that conversation going. I've tried to sort of offer this book really as something that is a work in progress. So in the same spirit, this is not, although at some point in time I had to draw a line under it and someone had to design it and print it, it's a work in progress. So if you think something needs developing or you think I've got something wrong, I'd be delighted to hear from you. So thank you very much for listening, and very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Neil. That's absolutely great. I was going to, oh, can people see me? Yes, they can see me. Yeah, so we've got some time for some questions. So I think importantly, it'll be questions from others rather than just from me. And I know we've got some coming in, but I just wanted to ask you, as I say, I've been lucky enough to start reading the book, and I've made copious notes, I have to say, and I won't go through them all now, but it's really fascinating. And I think some of the things that really stuck out for me were, I think you touched on the fact that even if you're not directly involved in a change management program, we're all dealing with change in every aspect of our lives. And I think the book for me, it was quite insightful in how I'm managing changes within my teams, in the way I'm going about my working life. And one of the things you touched on was this individual worldview. And it's the bias we may have that reinforces our opinion, and that we can actually bring that into any sort of element of change. So we bring our own bias. And I'm interested just to hear your thoughts on how in the past have you overcome those people that are involved in a change program who come with their own preconceived ideas and bias?
Well, I think it's important firstly to be conscious of it. Which is why it's in the section really, which is, you know, an attempt to sort of understand change. I would be pretty confident that most people involved in change programs on this call probably haven't had a specific conversation where worldviews have been considered or looked at. It's the UK sort of version of a German term, which I wouldn't even like to say I could get right, but Weltanschauung it seems to be. So it's a sort of one of those words that is, when it's translated back into English, doesn't seem to be quite as dramatic as the original. But I think it's important to acknowledge our own worldview and understand where our own biases lie. And when I showed you that sense-making tool, you know, that unknown knowns pain in terms of just making sure we're very, you know, that anything that we have somehow suppressed consciously or unconsciously is that we bring that to the surface. And we, as we approach a change program, we're very aware that we're bringing our own lens effectively, that we're looking through it. And it could be that it's a point in time for us to actually describe what that looks like, you know, to our colleagues, to say, look, this is the view that I have of the world. I'm putting it on the table here. But also, the rest of our team will be looking through their own lens, and everyone that's subject to our change initiative will be doing so as well. And you know, I've been fortunate enough in my career to lead change programs in a number of different countries. So you know, you're not just dealing with the sort of differences of worldview that you think might occur, but you're dealing with a huge shift in worldview in many instances. And I've led projects in, you know, the Far East, in the Middle East, in Central and Eastern Europe, where they've all been subject to very different influences and education programs in their lives, and the worldview just differs enormously. So I think it's something to talk about. I think it's something to acknowledge and to get out in the open at the earliest possible stage.
That's really interesting. And just one more thing I wanted to ask you. You touch as well on the need to be stoic and that whole concept of stoicism. And I'm wondering whether you think that now with the climate we're in and the increased challenges we've got, whether there is a need generally for us all to take a little bit more of a stoic view and not be, you know, just accepting of everything, but whether we need to be a little bit more resilient. Do you think there's anything in that?
I'm not sure. I'm going to have to go back and check it because I'm not sure I do suggest we need to be more stoic. I reference some of the sort of the stoic ideas, but I'm not sure I necessarily ascribe to them specifically. And
you just mentioned them, and I was just interested to see where you thought that fitted in the whole scheme.
It's and I think there's a lot of talk of resilience, particularly at the moment, because there's a view that suddenly working life has got tougher, and we need to be able to sort of cope with it more. I'm not necessarily. I think resilience is important, but I'm not necessarily sure that we're better looking at the causes of the forces that drive the need to be resilient, rather than just building resilience and just letting everything get worse around us. So what is it that is driving the need for us to be resilient in the first place? And we're better off sort of moving upstream and trying to address some of the causes. If we need to be more resilient because our jobs have got more stressful, then what's creating that stress? And in terms of trust, can we have an open and trusting and elementally safe conversation about those drivers of the stress, those creators of the stress, to help us all collectively deal with it? So I think it's, as I sort of referenced in the first book and comes through in this book, it's very often it's these things in balance. It's always about balance, and there is a balance between us having some resilience, because we can't crumble at the first sign of any difficulty we face. We need a degree of resilience, but I also think we need to be just as equally able to talk to one another about what it is that's causing difficulty for us, and to be able to air those views and share those views without prejudice and without feeling that somehow we're going to be disadvantaged by it.
And then just lastly, with all that we're going through, do you think change will speed up because of what we're going through now? So do you think more organisations will be looking to make big changes because of what we've been living for the last 7 or 8 months?
I'm not sure how you feel about it, and I'd be interested in the views, but it seems like there's a lot of people talking about it, not a lot of people doing it at the moment. It's I sort of mentioned it in something I was writing the other day. We've almost turned first mover advantage into first mover disadvantage, as in nobody wants to be the first person to take the leap. So there's lots of CEOs saying we're going to get rid of all of our property, and not many people seem to have actually exercised any lease breaks yet. No one's really jumping into, no one's really said, I know what the future workplace is going to be, and we're going to go and build it. There's a lot of, and I think it's the right approach. I think, some caution and some cool heads are necessary. And I think that we're still in a position where we're learning, and many aspects of our lives are actually on hold rather than changing rapidly at the moment. We're actually not doing a lot of things because we're not sure how they're going to turn out. But I do think that in relation to the workplace, applying the ideas that I've suggested in the book, the future needs to be far more emergent, far more evolutionary, in the sense of we need to make smaller changes, targeted changes, test them, measure them, have that feedback loop, look at life as, look at our world really in terms of it being a perpetual beta trial and an experimental, thinking about our workplace as having a value. Workplace 3.172. What happens next? We tend in workplace to look at fairly large scale projects, creation of fairly static realities most of the time. But I think actually what this whole crisis is telling us is that actually we need to take much more of a longer term, life cycle view of the workplace, rather than just punctuating it with events every 5 or 10 years.
Well, we've got a couple of questions coming. So Joanna Knight, is it hard to get companies to recognise the need for your approach? That's a question from Joanna.
Not sure. I haven't tried yet. Really, this is. I'm just getting started. Can I let you know in a few months' time? So I've as I said at the beginning, it was incredibly difficult writing about change. I mean, I have to say I faced my own sort of personal crises on a number of occasions trying to get through this, and did have lots of sort of self-doubt and sort of just wondering if I really was going down the right route. So it's a difficult subject area, but it's one that's absolutely critical to get right. And so I'm I'm trying with a couple of clients at the moment to sort of move programs into this sort of framework. I've taken this approach and I've put it into a sort of workplace related framework and structure, and it appears to make sense to me. So I'm sort of, I'm trying to move a few of these programs in that direction, but it is early days at the moment, and some people are quite comfortable with other models of change out there, and I'm not suggesting mine's better in any way at all. It's just an alternative, and there are some fairly well established sort of, usually with an acronym associated or a sort of, steps or whatever. There are quite a few models that you might be comfortable with using, in which case you wouldn't want to use this one. But I guess I've tried to make this sort of like just a little bit, because I've been a practitioner rather than a consultant for most of my career. Most of the little stories in here about where I've got it wrong, messed it up, and sort of what I've learned in the process of messing it up. And so I'd like to think that if you're following the program in here, you feel like I'm sort of in it with you and that we're doing this together.
Okay, now I've got a comment from Angela Wyborn. I feel resistance partly comes from the fear of losing control. With change should come trust, and not all companies want to relinquish the control and trust employees to enable employees to do what they do. What would you say to that, Neil?
I think this really comes down to the difference between adoption and adaptation. Unfortunately, most change programs are still very rooted in an adoption approach. And adoption is like sticking something on to something that already exists and hoping that it'll stay. It's like downloading an app on your phone. You're adopting that app, you're taking it on, you may or may not use it. You may, when you use it, decide that it's worthwhile keeping, but you're just as likely to jettison that as you are to retain it. So we're told we have to stick things on. We're given things to stick on to ourselves, new behaviors, new approaches, new etiquettes, or whatever they are. Here you go, this is what we expect you to do. And this is when we expect you to do it by. And time is one of the biggest problems in all of this. Whereas actually, if we give people the knowledge, the resources, and the rationale, and the time and the space to adapt rather than to adopt new behaviors, then we find that these potentially can be much more deep and lasting, because the human being has evolved rather than being asked to sort of stick something on. So that's a little bit like getting an upgrade to your own operating system on your phone. That's where something has changed and it's not going back. Evolution doesn't work in reverse. You might sort of start doing something that you did before, and it might bear some resemblance to something you did before, but all you're doing is you're evolving and you're moving forward still. So change programs, I think, that give people the resources, give people the knowledge to change themselves, and don't try and change people, are much more likely to give people the sense that they have control and they have some part to play and they have a responsibility. And I hope a number of the techniques in the book are geared towards people feeling much more comfortable. And if they can be heard, even if they're talking, nonsense, they still need to be heard, and we still need to understand it, because, and even in resistance, there is insight, and there are things we can learn. And it is quite important sometimes. If we've got a barrage of resistance, it's just possible that we might be doing something wrong, and we very rarely acknowledge that. But I talk in there about the size of the ask. Sometimes we forget that, if we're actually asking, we're the easiest people running this project to convince that it's the right thing to do. There is real value in resistance, and I would, those programs that try and sort of remove it and remove that control, kind of get what they deserve, really.
Right, we've had a comment from Pranay. I hope I've pronounced that right. What are your thoughts on The Office is Dead? Mark Eltringham will be curling up his toes at that. What are your thoughts, Neil?
Well, Mark and I usually have these really long, grumpy conversations between us. I'd shudder to think anyone would ever listen in, actually, but it's like, two old blokes have been in this game too long, really, sort of talking about all these things. But I agree with Mark that The Office is there's no way The Office is dead. It's not even partially dead. I think there are some welcome, we're going through a sort of a welcome reappraisal, and not before time, of the fundamental purpose of The Office. And I don't think there's anything wrong with us reconsidering the purpose of The Office. For too long, it's just supported routine, habitual attendance. It's tried to do everything, bit of everything. Everything's got to be in there because we've got to spend our lives there. And if there's one thing from an aesthetic point of view that I really hope the pandemic has killed off, it's trying to make our offices look like our homes. This domestication of the office. I mean, I think what will be really cool is that when everybody starts rebuilding offices from here, is that they'll make it look really different from home. So we feel that when we're not working at home, we're working somewhere different, and it feels different and it feels special for that. The last thing we want is to go from one lounge to another lounge. So I'm hoping that is sort of part of our future, but I think it's repurposing, and I always work with the triple bottom line. I think it's a really useful sort of check and balance in everything we do, which is it's got to work for people, it's got to work for the organisation, and it's got to work for the planet. And we forget sometimes that half-empty offices with people just exercising their own personal choice and coming and going are really not helping the organisation commercially, and they're certainly not helping the planet. Whatever certificate is stuck in the reception area, if it's half empty, it's not environmentally responsible. So, I think it's a really welcome time. But as I often say to people, it's up to us. We're not all going to sit there, make predictions on the future of the office and expect someone else to do it for us. This is something we've all got a part to play in. We're all involved. We can all help shape the future of the office. But what a fantastic opportunity we have. I said uncertainty is our opportunity, and it applies in the workplace area and to the office probably more than it's ever done in the whole time I've been in this business, possibly for the whole time the office has ever existed.
Before I do all my thank yous and things, does anyone have any more questions, anything they'd like to ask Neil while we have him here? I think we've covered quite a lot of information here. I think that's it, Neil. If anyone has, we're just getting lots of thank yous in now, Neil. I'd just like to round off really thanking you so much for this. And just on a personal level, I would urge everyone to read it, because just from a better understanding yourself and our human nature, it's really, really, really insightful. I wanted to leave you with one thing that I read that I did share with Neil before I came on, but I'd like to read it because I had an aha moment, sat up in bed with my husband, and it wasn't because of my husband, I hasten to add. I never get those with him anymore. But anyway, moving swiftly on, he gives a note of caution and describes consciously and deliberately spreading accountability like buttering toast to arrive at a can't fire us all situation can lead to paralysis. This type of avoidance is not a solution. Neither should it be confused with democratization. And I just think, to end on that, absolutely extraordinary. It made me think, I do that. I am constantly doing that. I'm going to stop doing that. And as with your first book, there are some really wonderful human insights that I found fascinating. So I would urge everyone to read it because it's a great read. Thank you so, so much. And if any of you on the call want to put any more questions to Neil after the call, we can get them to him. So please feel free.
That'd be fantastic. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's been great to be able to talk to you all. And yeah, I'm very happy to continue the conversation. I always put my email address in the book, and or you can get me on LinkedIn. And as I say, it's open source. It's a sort of, we've had to draw a line under it for publication, but hopefully it'll evolve over time, and your contribution will be fabulous. Thank you.
Yep, thanks. And thanks, KI, very much for hosting this, and see you on the next call, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.